Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our CCIA panel discussion entitled Digital Innovation and the Transformation of the U.S. Economy. I'm Krisztian Katona, Vice President of Global Competition and Regulatory Policy at CCIA, and I will serve as moderator of today's panel discussion. I'm really delighted to introduce a truly all-star lineup of leading economists and experts as our panelists today. First, and in alphabetical order, Ben Armstrong, who is Executive Director of the Work of the Future Initiative at MIT. Next, Ashish Arora, who is the Rex D. Adams Professor of Business Administration at Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. Next is Guy Ben-Ishai. Guy is Head of Economic Policy Research at Google. Our next speaker then is Marshall Reinsdorf, who is Economic Statistics Consultant. Dr. Reinsdorf was formerly with the International Monetary Fund. And Susan E. Woodward, who is founder of Sand Hill Econometrics and formerly Chief Economist of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and also the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Welcome, and thank you all for joining me today. Now, I'd like to turn to our topic, digital innovation and the transformation of the U.S. economy. Technological innovation, especially in the digital economy, is fueling a historic economic transformation in the United States. And innovation is impacting inflation, supply chains, remote work and labor developments, and US competitiveness at a time when all of these subjects are very much in the news and very frequently discussed. During our program, with our panel of experts, we will explore the latest economic research on the transformative effects of technology and digital innovation on the US economy. We've got a lot of interesting issues and relevant research to cover during our program today. And I'd like to start with discussing how digital innovation is helping shape the US economy. Dr. Guy Ben-Ishai has done some research in this area. Guy, I'm turning to you first. Could you please set the stage for our discussion and discuss how innovation in the digital economy is helping shape the US economy? In particular, have we witnessed the transformation of the US economy in the past 2 or 3 years? Did the digital economy play a role in this transformation? And if so, what role? Guy?
Krisztian, thank you. And let me maybe start by saying first that, yes, absolutely. Using the term historic economic transformation is precisely the language that we should use here. As you described in your program. As economists, we have this tendency to focus on the negatives. And of course, we still have objectively a number of COVID-related challenges like inflation and supply chain disruptions that are indeed serious. But, we should not let that distract us from the fact that we have just witnessed an unprecedented recovery that was both unique and remarkable in so many different ways. And let me start first by mentioning or kind of talking about the term, in terms of the speed at which we rebounded back to pre-crisis levels. It's not just that it was officially the shortest economic recession on record. But more importantly, it's the notion that it was only 2 years ago that we experienced the highest rate of unemployment in modern times, 14.7%. And if you think about that, within a single year in 2021, that unemployment rate was followed by the largest GDP growth in nearly 4 decades. So I think that it's remarkable that in our day and age, we're living through arguably one of the most important macroeconomic shocks to the US economy, and that it's taking place with such incredible speed. So, but the macroeconomic variables that I just mentioned, they don't really tell the full story. And Krisztian, you asked about digital technologies. And one of the truly unique narratives, which is not really captured in these variables, is the tremendous growth of digital solutions and how they actually became central to the economic recovery. And maybe to illustrate that, let me make 2 basic observations. So the first one relates to remote work digital infrastructure. The kind of tools and digital tools that we're using right now in this call. So although the tools existed well before COVID, and they were not frequently used, but during the pandemic, within a matter of just weeks, we saw a monumental shift in adoption of digital collaboration tools. So if it wasn't for investment in digital infrastructure that enabled safe and reliable remote collaboration tools, labor market recovery would have unquestionably looked different. And if we carefully think about the counterfactual, which is what we need to do as economists, what unemployment would have looked like and how long it would have taken unemployment to decline back to pre-COVID rates, if it wasn't for such investments, I think that if you think about that counterfactual, that's when we kind of get a sense of truly how the importance of these investments. The second observation I want to make is about e-commerce and online retail. So we learned from small businesses during the pandemic that digital solutions were critical for them to connect with customers and to access markets, ultimately to endure the economic downturn. And it turns out that that feedback that we received was quite significant. And McKinsey estimated, along with other institutes in economic think tanks, McKinsey estimated that e-commerce sales soared during the crisis. Globally, but particularly in the US, where we had a high adoption rate of digital tools to begin with. And as a percentage of total retail or overall retail, e-commerce sales roughly tripled in 2020 alone. So at a time when the US economy was rapidly contracting, digital tools were not only used to keep millions of small businesses afloat, but they actually served also as a significant growth. They also led, a significant growth in market-wide retail sales. So considering just these two observations alone, between the remarkable transformation of labor markets and the dramatic increase in digital commerce, I think it's quite evident that digital technologies have both fueled economic growth and contributed to greater economic resilience. Now, the digital economy, of course, does not operate in a vacuum, and it's governed by legal rules and regulatory institutions. And as technology evolves, so does the need to develop new regulations and new rules. And even our discussion right now, our discussion today, focuses on the economic contributions of digital technologies. But I think that it is important to mention that there are current efforts in Congress to pass antitrust legislation that would target and regulate technology firms in ways in which may actually unintentionally undermine such contributions. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So, Krisztian, quickly, just to summarize my statement, yes, absolutely. A historic transformation of the US economy is very much the right framework and the right language for the program. And I think it would be misguided to overlook the fact that digital technologies have been at the very front and center of such transformation, or that their economic contribution, the economic contribution of digital technologies, critically depends on the rules and regulations that may be passed by Congress. And with that, let me send it back to you.
Sure. Thank you, guys, for these observations and for setting the stage for our discussion today. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Ben Armstrong. And Dr. Armstrong's research and teaching examine how workers, firms, and regions adapt to technological change. And Ben, also following up on Guy's initial remarks, could you discuss how digital innovation has transformed the US economy during the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Krisztian. I think there are two ways to think about digital innovation here. One is the creation of new digital technologies, both for consumers and for industry. And then the second is change in how those technologies are used and implemented by consumers and firms. And one thing that happened during the pandemic, which many of us experienced, is that we began to use existing technologies differently. I'm in higher education, and many of the online course tools, e-learning tools that we began using when universities went online, they were already available. This wasn't an innovation in new technologies. There was change in how we use them. And there's reflection from various folks in higher ed that we almost needed a crisis to understand how effective these tools could be for higher education. Similarly with remote work, as Guy was talking about. So when we think about digital innovation in the context of the pandemic, I don't think it was necessarily a lot of new patents for new inventions or pushing the limits, although there have been advances that might be going under the radar in new algorithms to improve business services, for example. But a lot of the innovation that I was observing was innovation in how we've adapted and used technology tools that already existed beforehand. Like I mentioned, there were these tectonic shifts in consumer demand, shifting from services to hard goods. There was a big bounce back of foreign trade, almost increasing reliance on imports after we had shut down imports, which I find really remarkable. And as someone who studies manufacturing, I saw a real missed opportunity. While many of the pioneering services companies in the US were able to pivot to remote work, there was not a similar flexibility among US manufacturers to adapt to really the highest demand for domestic production in recent history. And I'm happy to talk further about why there was a missed opportunity for domestic manufacturers and how U.S. manufacturers might capture that opportunity before demand shifts back overseas.
Thank you, Ben. I think it would be interesting to talk about that missed opportunity as kind of like part of our discussion, like later as well. But I also like to touch upon another important topic that you focus on in your research, Ben, and that's this common theme running through several of your recent papers is that large US firms have become significantly more productive, while smaller firms' productivity has been lagging behind. And I was wondering, based on your research, what is driving these productivity trends, and what do you think, what can be done to enhance the productivity of non-leading firms? And can the digital economy play a role in this space?
Yeah, let me talk about this particularly in the context of manufacturing. When we look at large factories versus small factories, large factories you can think of more than 500 employees, small factories less than 100. And large factories have always been, for a variety of reasons, marginally more productive, have marginally higher wages than small factories. One reason for this is they have a different mix of products, is that large factories are more likely to produce high volumes, smaller variety of products that they can just do more productively due to economies of scale, whereas smaller factories are more likely to have lower volumes of a high mix of products. So that's just a almost structural disadvantage to these smaller factories. But what we've seen is that disadvantage grow over time. So in the 70s, a large factory might have been 30 to 50% more productive than a small factory. And now a large factory is double the productivity of a small factory. And when you break this down into components, you see that large factories are investing more in technology. That's where you get to the digital innovation part. Capital expenditures per worker are much higher at large factories. Now they're triple what they are at small factories. And also there's a competition for talent that large factories are winning. Large factories pay higher wages, and they have more capacity to train and use external training resources than small factories. So really there's the technology and talent inputs that lead to higher productivities and output for these larger firms.
Thank you for that. But looking at digital innovation, your research also discusses kind of like the increased use of robots and automation. And I was wondering if you could also comment on kind of like what your research suggests in that regard, like how the increased use of robots and automation would do, what did it do to US productivity and employment in that space? But also, and importantly, how do you see kind of like the government's role in that regard? What could be the government's role, and what can the government play as a role in that space to support the increased use of automation and other advanced technologies into the workplace?
Yeah, the goal for U.S. manufacturing to avoid future missed opportunities like the one we were discussing is to become more productive, and we can think about productivity as linked to competitiveness. So if we want manufacturing to be more productive, and we think there's something about the skills of the workforce and the technological capabilities of factories is being important for productivity. We want to incentivize new and better technology at manufacturers. How do we do this? Right now, I think it's important to recognize as a baseline that US manufacturers, only a small share of them have high technological capabilities. When you see videos of autonomous factories or robotic cells, these are the exceptions, not the rules. Just under 10% of US factories have any robots at all, and about half of those factories use robots only very, very minimally. So when we look at the firms that do use robots, A, they're the exception, and B, they're very competitive. They're much more competitive than their counterparts. There are studies that show that the workers in these firms have opportunities to make higher wages, and those firms are more likely to be productive. So we see links between technology acquisition and productivity. And then the question is, like you mentioned, Krisztian, how do you drive technology adoption into firms that have been lagging behind in technology? There's a program in Massachusetts that I think has some promise. It's called the MMAT program, which subsidizes, really, the state helps share the cost of risky technology investments, or technology investments that manufacturers might perceive as risky, so that they might be able to buy a new machine, let's say a robotic welding cell, even if they don't have the contracts or the business to support that acquisition. Because right now there's a chicken and egg problem. If you're a small manufacturer, you might need a new contract to justify the purchase of new equipment, but without the new equipment, you might not be able to go out and get that new contract. So the state has stepped in to try to give these manufacturers a boost in advancing their technological capabilities and gaining new business as a result.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to make our panel discussion as interactive as possible. So I'm also turning to our other panelists and wanted to see if any of you would have any thoughts, comments, or reactions to Ben's points and research.
Krisztian, I have one comment and one question. I'll be the first one to jump in.
Go ahead, Guy.
Terrific. So let me maybe start by mentioning the following. So just to put Ben's comments in context, why these challenges and missed opportunities are so important. We should just keep in mind that if you actually think about it, post-war, and very much up until the late 1960s, manufacturing accounted for roughly 1/3 of our employment. Whereas today, after decades of decline and erosion, that number is down to only 8%. So, that is, we essentially went down from 1 of every 3 Americans held a manufacturing job post-war to less than 1 of 10 today. That is a significant shift in the composition of our labor force. And this decline in manufacturing jobs suggests that we may be actually facing a choice between 2 strategies or 2 approaches. We can either, one, find another source for job creation that can replace manufacturing. And, job growth in the digital economy has certainly offset some of these losses in manufacturing. Or B, we can try to revive advanced manufacturing by promoting more automation, by implementing more technology, so that would essentially increase productivity and lead to more employment in manufacturing. So it's actually, I think that this is actually a foundational question. What is our vision for a successful job creation in productive labor markets in the US over the next 2 or 3 decades? Do we invest in what seems to be our relative advantage right now? Consumers facing digital technologies, or do we invest in segments that we may have offshored before to foreign rivals, but now with the advancements of new technologies and automation, maybe we can find us generating greater value and better jobs again? So Ben, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. I'm sure you do, but I guess my question is, which of the 2 approaches may be more appropriate looking forward? And which one's more consistent with our current direction? And, maybe just a qualification, I'll keep it short, and of course, let me just mention the obvious. We economists, I guess, cannot really design or dictate these directions or approaches. At best, we can advance policies that would put in place incentives to invest or to shape markets in such a way. It's probably an obvious qualification, but probably relevant.
Yeah, there's been a cottage industry of manufacturing defenders dating back to the 80s now, when there have been calls for the past 30 years to say, well, let's use the lessons of comparative advantage to really focus on the strengths in U.S. innovation. We can innovate here, produce elsewhere, and really rely on imports of the goods that are lower value added and aren't going to create good jobs and have strong spillover effects for the U.S. economy. And even in the 2000s, after really Chinese import dependence grew, China joined the WTO, and we became more and more dependent on goods from East and Southeast Asia. People like Larry Summers were saying, do we really need manufacturing? Looks a lot like agriculture, where a smaller and smaller share of the American workforce is going to be employed in this sector, and that's okay. Now, my colleagues at MIT have, who work on these topics, we make a few arguments about why it's important to continue to focus on manufacturing, and I think that our arguments have been vindicated during the pandemic and even during the recent let's say a baby formula shortage, but other the chip shortage, I think vindicates some of the challenges associated with really seeding the electronic component market and seeding a lot of the semiconductor and microelectronics market to Asia. But really the arguments are threefold. One is that there are real strategic interests in having a strong U.S. Domestic manufacturing sector. Not only is that important for the national defense, which requires to have U.S. production, but the U.S. production for the Department of Defense and other national interests is actually weaker if U.S. manufacturers can't also produce for commercial markets, because manufacturers that just produce for defense are actually less innovative and less competitive if they don't also play in what might be a harder game of export-driven markets. So that's number one, is national defense. Second is that we find over and over again that when a region or a country is good at production, those production capabilities spill over into innovation. That innovative companies learn something during the production process that might also improve their R&D and the engineering of new products. So there's this link between production and innovation that you could see with Apple. When Apple does manufacturing in China, for example, a lot of their designers and those Apple employees at the cutting edge of innovation need to spend a lot of time near the line, near the factory floor, to understand where they might be able to improve their devices. So number two would be spillovers to innovation. And number three, like you said, is good jobs. That what we've seen over the last 30 years is the stagnation of wages and job opportunities for people without a college degree. Historically, when U.S. manufacturing was thriving, there were upwardly mobile careers and wage gains for people without a college degree in production and related jobs. Manufacturing jobs aren't what they used to be in terms of the competitiveness of their wages. Manufacturing wages have been flat for a long time, but we do see competitive upwardly mobile careers for people without a college degree in advanced manufacturing, should the U.S. continue to invest and grow those industries. So let's set aside those three reasons, Guy, and take your point. So even with those benefits, to what extent should we care about manufacturing? Should we only care for, let's say, the supply chain difficulties or critical goods like baby formula? I don't think it's necessary to, for example, produce T-shirts and shoes in the United States, these commodities with low value added. But if we do begin to understand which industries are A, strategically important, and B, can have those high spillovers for innovation in adjacent sectors, I think electronics and microelectronics is really key to have U.S. capabilities, both for defense reasons, but also because I think it will improve the base of innovative electronic companies in the U.S. Those are the types of industries where I think the U.S. can compete and should try to compete.
Right. I have a question for you, Ben.
Go ahead,
It's
Mark.
about workforce. So you talked about these high-tech factories creating jobs for workers without a college education. But I always thought a lot of this advanced technology actually skews towards more educated workers. And there creates a little bit of a gap between the skills of our labor force and the skills that are actually going to be needed in new advanced manufacturing. So let me make the point even more clear. Morris Chang, the founder of the major semiconductor producer in Taiwan, said the United States won't be able to reshore production of semiconductors because there's not enough educated engineers in the US to man the plants. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about the skill mix of the labor force and how that plays into this advancing technology?
Sure, and I've read that Morris Chang quote for sure, and I know that there are planned investments among semiconductor companies, including TSMC, in the United States. So I think there's some competing evidence of where the money's going in terms of U.S. investment and what the capabilities are. I know MIT's also invested in that pipeline of engineers who can support chip fabs. But also, if you look at, I don't want to get sidelined in terms of microelectronics, but there are community college programs to support fabs like the Global Foundries facility in upstate New York. So it's not just high PhD level folks who are supporting these plants, but semiconductor is more of the exception rather than the rule in terms of skills in manufacturing. One thing that I think has been demonstrated over and over as a myth is that the skills gap in manufacturing, which is often how it's discussed, is a gap between really advanced companies that have all this wonderful automated equipment and then employees who don't know how to operate that equipment. What we see is that the vast majority of companies don't have that equipment, so they don't need the skills in order to man the equipment. And if anything, community colleges have been offering advanced CNC courses, robotics technician training programs, when the firms where their graduates can actually get jobs might not have a need for those advanced skills. So we see almost an opposite problem. But the good evidence, Marshall, and what you're mentioning is that when firms do adopt those new technologies, so I've been working with this, studying this firm in Ohio that has invested a lot heavily in robots, and it's gone from an entry-level technician machinist who's really was about a 40K salary a year to having an opportunity to have more like a 60K entry level salary a year. And for someone without a college degree, where 40K is almost the median, that jump is really significant. It creates a better job opportunity for them, but it also requires more training and more skills.
Thank you, Ben. I think we have a lot of ground to cover, and we'll discuss some of these points additionally, especially from a kind of like global competitiveness angle. But I also saw that, Susan, you had perhaps a quick follow-up question. Did you want to chime in, or shall we? Well, there's a lot of ground to cover, but please, if there's anything else that you wanted to follow up on based on.
Oh, it was just a quick comment that if you spend a little bit of time staring at the quarterly census of earnings and wages, which is the only data that we have in the US that really has counts of firms by firm size and employment by firm size, that data set is about 30 years old right now, and it just shows this absolutely uniform movement of employment out of smaller firms and into bigger firms at every single category year after year.
That's a helpful comment. Yeah, perhaps just to move things forward, because we have a lot of ground to cover. I'd like like perhaps next to turn to discussing some of the work and research done by Dr. Marshall Reinsdorf. And Marshall, like your research explores how the digital economy influences inflation, and in particular, how potential mismeasurement of digital products and innovation could influence mismeasurements of inflation. Marshall, could you tell us what your research suggests about the relationship between inflation and technological innovation, please?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
I've been working on this project for quite a while, and I guess there's two parts to the work I've done. Some of it is just to document that, technology has always been a factor countering inflation. Let's call it a deflationary influence. And the high-tech sector, digital sector is one of the places where there's a lot of progress in new technology, and you can certainly see it in the numbers. We had 20 years of low inflation, partly due to low inflation in the digital sector and taking advantages of the opportunities created by digital technology. So I've also taken a look more recently at what happened when inflation took off. Did the digital economy take off with it, or is the digital economy still exerting a deflationary influence? And for the most part, the answer is it's still a deflationary influence. We haven't seen quite as much pickup in inflation in the digital economy as in the rest of the economy. As far as mismeasurement, that's been another major interest. After around 2005, productivity slowed down. And everybody said the numbers can't really be that bad. There must be something we're getting wrong on measurements. So we've had a big hunt for sort of overstated inflation because of missed influences, say, of new kinds of products and new ways of buying things. Quality improvements are not fully adjusted for, and there's a lot of them in digital technology. So that's one factor. You can also say that savings you get from being able to buy online or from the vendors you find online or from, say, sharing economy and other technological innovations, not really reflected in the inflation numbers. A third issue I've looked at is just the weights. If they have a little bit of a slow process in updating the weighting system in their inflation measures to match the current economy, and the digital sector is growing quite fast and exhibiting low inflation, just by getting the old weights, you'll underweight the deflationary influence of the digital economy. So that's been another area of mismeasurement I've looked at.
Thank you, Marshall. And based on your research, does the introduction of new digital technologies and services, do they reduce inflation?
Well, there's two questions, right? Do they reduce measured inflation, and do they reduce inflation as it should be measured? So for sure, they have a very strong deflationary influence on inflation as it should be measured. Normally, if you take into account the quality improvements in areas with advancing technology, the new products are a better value than the old products, which is why people switch to the new products. And the degree to which that better value gets captured in the inflation statistics varies. It's challenging to do those kind of comparisons, to bring in stuff into their price indexes quickly as it appears. So I would say we do have a significant amount of under measurement of inflation. Well, significant. It was significant in the old days when inflation was running 2% and we were, say, overstating it by 0.5%. I guess if we're overstating inflation by 0.5% in today's world, it doesn't look so big compared to 8% or 7% overall, but it's still a real concern. And then also ways people can save money by buying from cheaper outlets have typically not been reflected. All these problems, I might add, are hard. I would say the statistical agencies have done a pretty good job of bringing their methods up to date to capture all the stuff that's easy to capture. So we're talking about the hard stuff now, but yes, that's been part of my research.
Thank you. Just following up on some of those points, Marshall, with respect to e-commerce and products that are sold online, I think, research by Austin Goolsbee and Peter Klenow on digital inflation has suggested that digital inflation has been well below inflation in the rest of the economy for years, and that digital inflation was negative for several categories of goods for many years, while it was positive outside of the digital economy. I think the Adobe Digital Price Index, based on their research, really continues and has continued to show relatively lower digital inflation than headline inflation for comparable goods categories. Marshall, I was wondering if you could comment on this, and is the Goolsbee and Klenow research consistent with your own findings?
Well, let me make two comments. It's true that, Goolsbee and Klenow basically helped launch the Adobe Digital Price Index. And it's been operated using the methodology they helped to develop ever since. And as you pointed out, it does tend to show a lot lower inflation. I think in recent times, it's been running around 3%. So if we had a 3% inflation rate, we'd be much happier than with the 7%. Now, this is partly due to the product mix that people buy online, because it's basically reflecting purchases online, and electronics have a pretty big weight. Electronics are lower, so you wouldn't get quite as dramatic a gap between the digital world inflation or e-commerce inflation and general inflation if you controlled for the product mix, but still it's been consistently lower for quite a long time. If you might say, is there any independent verification? So Amazon did research on apparel prices. They actually published a paper on Amazon apparel prices and pretty much found the same kind of numbers that Adobe Digital Price Index was showing, which is at that time, the CPI was roughly 0, maybe slightly positive, and they got negative inflation in the online apparel. So yes, there's been a tradition now. Recently, there have been a few cases of high inflation in the digital world, hopefully transitory, apparel being one of them. But the other comment I wanted to make is there's also a level difference. So, during the pandemic, people really switched to buying online a lot more than they used to. There's a big movement. There's a paper by Alberto Cavallo where he says online prices average about 5% lower than what people used to pay when they only shopped offline. So that's a saving that wouldn't be picked up. Then the other, I guess, issue to make on this is that, as the CPI is sort of underweighting a lot, they don't miss the digital e-commerce. It's in there, but it's in there with weights that reflect purchasing patterns from 3 or 4 years ago. So this could be a significant cause some overstatement of inflation just by giving too little weight to what's going on in the digital world. And I want to finally make the point that if you combine sort of e-commerce with search engines where you can find stuff, if you tried to track the average price people pay for an item with so many opportunities to shop around, it could drop significantly compared to the average offered price at traditional outlets. So that gives you a little bit of flavor. I guess I can maybe make one more comment about e-commerce and the pandemic you might find interesting. So I got interested in my research in the early part of the pandemic. I had a theory, and I wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought of it more or less at the same time, which is that inflation is way higher than we think. So now we're talking 2020. We're not talking today. The reason being that the stuff people were mostly buying after the pandemic tended to be the stuff that was going up the fastest. People spent a lot of their budget on things like food, for example. And the things that people weren't buying, which was transportation, actually were falling. So when I did this little study, one thing I discovered was a big difference between apparel prices in countries with a lot of e-commerce versus countries where e-commerce wasn't so well developed. So you saw actually more of a crash in apparel prices in the places without e-commerce. And you say, well, sure, those guys, you can't go to the store anymore. Their demand is completely dead. At least if you can buy online, you can still buy apparel if you want it. So it was kind of a reminder that apparel kind of made certain amount of product availability and employment continue that would have probably been lost without that opportunity.
Understand. Thank you, Marshall, for that. I, wanted to make sure that, perhaps if we have additional questions, we can just cover it at the end of the discussion, but perhaps I will just move on then to Susan and our next two experts, Susan and Ashish, have researched how current legislative proposals that target large technology companies could impact the US startup and innovation ecosystems. And in that regard, first I will turn to Dr. Susan Woodward. And Dr. Woodward's research examines in particular how the US startup ecosystem and the role of exit opportunities, such as acquisitions and IPOs, in really motivating both startup founders and early investors like venture capitalists. Susan, based on your research and findings, can you briefly describe for us how the US startup ecosystem operates and also who the key types of players are in the startup ecosystem?
Got to get mute off.
There we go. So my main focus has not been on all startups. It's been on the startups that get funding through venture capital organizations. And the way this works is people who have ideas go around to the various venture funds and pitch their ideas and try to get the venture funds to fund them. And if the venture funds think they're promising, they'll give them some money, not enough money to get them to full independence, but enough for them to develop their ideas. And then if that's promising, they'll give them some more money, and then yet some more money. And the typical company does 3 or 4, sometimes many more rounds of funding, but typically 3 or 4 before it exits. And the exits consist of IPOs. Those are the most spectacular. They get the most publicity. You hear a lot about them, but it's actually only about 4% of the exits. And then there's about 33, 35% of the companies that just fail completely. Now, they don't go bankrupt. They're shut down in an orderly fashion, but they go out of business and they're worthless. Then the ones in between the 4 and 35, roughly 60% of the companies are acquired. And about half of those companies are acquired for a value that makes everybody happy. All of the investors get paid and the founders have something at the end. The others are acquired for a value that doesn't give investors all of their money back. And so the founders are basically out of luck. And so this means that, altogether, between the companies that fail totally and the companies that are acquired for a value that's lower than the money they raised while they were in their funding stage, 60 or 65% of the founders are walking away from the companies they found with nothing. And so the legislation seems very focused on inhibition of acquisition of venture-funded companies. And I would ask the people who are sponsoring this legislation to have a hard look at the numbers on venture capital outcomes, because if they really seriously inhibit acquisitions, they're going to really seriously inhibit venture activity overall. It will be a discouragement to the potential founders and a big discouragement to the investors if acquisition is not a feasible outcome for the companies that we work on. And this research, by the way, is restricted to the non-biotech part of the venture capital universe. So these are the tech companies and software, hardware, and some retail, and even the retail, of course, is very digital. So acquisition is the main outcome, main successful outcome of venture-funded companies. And if we inhibit it, we're going to have less of it.
That's very helpful. So most startups are currently acquired IPO instead, based on your research, or like what would be kind of like the nature of the venture exits as well?
I'm sorry, I must have missed a word because I thought I described the venture exits. About 4% of them do an IPO. About a third of them fail completely. The ones in between get acquired. Half of those are happy acquisitions where everyone makes some money, and the others are acquisitions where the investors do not get all of their money back.
Mm-hmm. And then so zooming out a bit and also looking at the broader economic picture, I was wondering if you could comment on how and then why the startup ecosystem is relevant then to US innovation and competitiveness as well.
Well, it seems as though mainly it's because if you look at the long history of how ideas are funded, banks have not been very important in the United States. They were much more important in Europe for a long, long time. And so as a consequence, European stock markets are not as highly developed as US stock markets are. And especially in the early days, venture funding was very focused on the IPO. Now, IPO activity declined in a fairly serious way after Sarbanes-Oxley passed in 2002, because it made the burden of being a public company much more serious. Now, that doesn't seem to have inhibited venture funding. Venture funding is still enormous and just about doubled from 2020 to 2021. and is seeing a little dip now with the stock market being down. But venture capital is definitely bigger in the United States than it is in other parts of the world, represents a bigger share of innovation. And of course, you look at our 5 very largest companies, and they were all venture funded in their early days.
Thank you, Susan. I also just wanted to open it up again here for just a minute to see if any of our panelists have any thoughts, comments, or any feedback on the research of Susan. I don't know, Guy, others? Otherwise, we can just continue our conversation. Thank you so much, Susan. Perhaps, I will just, in the interest of time, we'll move on now to Dr. Ashish Arora. And Dr. Arora's research focuses on the economics of technology and technological change. Ashish has studied the US innovation ecosystem, identifying both sources of continuing US leadership, but also sources of fragility, particularly with respect to advances in foreign markets like China. Ashish, based on your research, I wanted to ask you do we face meaningful risks of losing our global US leadership in emerging technologies? And also, could you tell us what role do US-based technology firms play in retaining such leadership?
Yes, thank you, Krisztian. This has been very interesting to listen to, and I'll just piggyback on Susan's comments before I get to answering yours. First, I think it's important to take a long-run view. US economic prosperity critically depends upon innovation. And as Susan pointed out, we have an innovation ecosystem, and it has 3 legs. There are the universities, the startups, and of course, the established incumbent firms, the market leaders. For a recent study that was sponsored by PPI, what we found was that when you look at US competitiveness or US leadership, science and technology leadership in specific digital domains, we see that in general, the US is a leader. There are segments where it faces challenges. What's interesting is that the segments where the US leads are those where the established incumbents are investing in innovation, and in particularly in upstream research. This is important. We frequently talk about R&D as if it were one word, but R&D is actually 2. There's research and there's development. And what we found was US competitiveness depends heavily upon the incentives and abilities of the market leaders of the large established firms to invest in research in R, not just in D. And so, there are a number of reasons which I'll quickly get to. But the bottom line is this: the research that happens in companies is different than what the other sectors of the other parts of the ecosystem do. In particular, startups and universities will not do the kinds of research that happens in large established corporations. If you to make this sort of tangible, think about what happens. Think about machine translation. We all use Translate on your favorite sort of digital platform. Think about what's involved. You need expertise in linguistic science. You need, of course, artificial intelligence, machine learning. You also need expertise in software and advances in software and data storage. And finally, you needed to make this happen, you needed advances in microprocessor design and semiconductor design. This kind of thing is very difficult to pull off in a startup. And Susan can talk about, how a VC would react if a startup came and said, I want to do all of these things. They would probably not fund it. And it will not happen in universities. I can attest to that. So just to summarize, corporations are an important part of the ecosystem. In particular, the research that happens in companies is very important. Now, then we next move to the question of, well, what are the incentives? Why are companies investing in what is essentially a public good, which is creating knowledge for everybody? And there, this is a complicated question, but let me just say that the scale and scope of the sponsoring firm are very important. Research is a long-term risky enterprise. You need this kind of long runway for those investments to happen. Second, research is uncertain. When you start investing in something, you're not exactly sure what kinds of downstream products it'll get applied to. So again, let's take the example of artificial intelligence. It's what we call a general purpose technology. You might use it for search, you might use it for translation, you might use it to predict cyber attacks, but equally, you can take the same underlying technology and use it to see how proteins fold, which is fundamental for understanding how life works, and to do drug discovery. And the implication of that is the companies that are going to invest in this kind of fundamental upstream work need to be able to have the option of creating new markets, of creating new products and entering new markets. Without it, their investments, their incentives to invest in this kind of long-term research would be impaired. And I'll remind you, these research investments by companies are crucial to American competitiveness. Now to your question, I'm not an antitrust expert, but I will simply say this, as Susan pointed out, is when we design policies, we must be very careful to think about the unintended consequences. And what would be the unintended consequences? How would they impair? How would some of these proposed legislations, how would they affect the incentives of the companies to make these kinds of long-run, significant, and sort of uncertain and risky investments? Let me end there.
Thank you, Ashish. I actually wanted to exactly follow up on some of these points, that Susan made as well, especially focusing on the federal legislative proposals that then would impose significant restrictions on technology firms at a larger corporate scale and scope. But I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more on how you think, how would such restrictions impact US corporate R&D spending and our competitive position globally? Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
So let me answer a related question. Most of my research has been focused on, in the recent past, on the incentives to invest in research. If you look at R&D together, there's a lot of R&D. Most of it tends to be downstream development. I suspect there might be some effect on D, but I don't want the sort of focus on aggregate R&D to take away the attention on the importance of this upstream research, which in a sense is the pacemaker of innovation. So it's not a big chunk of the R&D dollar, of the R&D budget, but it's vital. Without it, you don't get to sort of have effective R&D. It's not very efficient. And my sense is that these sort of blunt attempts, which may be well-intentioned, have a very serious risk of impairing the incentives to invest in to invest in research. And following that, I suspect it would affect R&D. And I would sort of piggyback on what Susan said. A lot of the innovations that ultimately get introduced into the marketplace tend to be complex, right? So I gave you the example of Translate, but there are many others. And a lot of the acquisitions that Susan described are companies picking up these individual pieces that they need and putting them together to produce a product that which is what the marketplace wants. The marketplace doesn't necessarily want a faster algorithm for doing X. It wants a quicker translation product or a more efficient voice recognition or something of that kind. And so some of these legislations run the risk of hurting the ability to put these complex pieces together and to present them to the marketplace.
Thank you, Ashish. It's been a truly fascinating discussion, but looking at the clock, I think, and unfortunately we have run out of time now. So with that, I'd really like to thank our panelists for the thoughtful remarks and this is really the substantive discussion. To each of you, our panelists, thank you very much for participating in today's CCIA event. And I also like to thank all of our viewers for watching. If you're interested, you can also find additional resources on digital innovation and technology issues on CCIA's website, which is ccianet.org. And for today, thanks again, and goodbye to all of you. Thank you.